Hi, everyone. So our hackathon team yesterday asked sort of a similar question to one of the presentations earlier, but we looked at it in a different way. So I think it's interesting, actually, that we ended up on a similar topic. So we were also curious. The media narrative during the Kavanaugh trial seemed to think that the trial would have an impact on the election, whether for like helping Republicans or helping Democrats. So we wanted to take a look at that for our project. So these were our main questions. First, we used some of the CAPS and the Rasmussen data, and we just looked at Kavanaugh favorability by party. And we don't have this plot on here, but we also broke it up by gender. And what we found was that Republican women's support of Kavanaugh looked much more like Republican men's support than it looked like women who identified with other parties. And so this was sort of a first indication that support for Kavanaugh, or just the issue in general with Kavanaugh in the election, was more of a partisan issue than any sort of gendered issue. And so men were more supportive of Kavanaugh within each party, but the parties were much closer together, and the partisan difference in Kavanaugh support was really driving the differences.
For context, we looked at Texas specifically, and we wanted to see where Kavanaugh support was visually within these counties. First, we looked at how Beto overperformed Hillary counties, and you see they're beyond just metro counties. You'd see the rural counties outside and north. But below that, we saw that he won counties that had massively red Kavanaugh support, and even with the election results.
I'll just go back really quickly. So one of the things we wanted to do is estimate support for Kavanaugh at the county level in Texas. And we used the Rasmussen National Tracker to do that. And at the risk of flogging a dead horse, we used MRP. So we estimated vote choice for various subgroups. It was age interacted by race and education, using MRP, partial pooling. And then we used L2 voter file data to estimate the approximate sizes of our various demographic subgroups within each county. And the map on the top right is our estimate of Kavanaugh favorability in each county in Texas. And then we tried to relate that to other county characteristics. So here we're plotting Cruz's actual vote share in the Senate race against Kavanaugh favorability, which we estimated. And I believe the correlation was, 0.5. So suggestive evidence here, but that there's a relationship between those two things. Oh, and we're at conclusions.
Yeah. Just to go back over it, what we found from this data, and you could dig more into it, but we thought it was suggestive of the idea that the impact of Kavanaugh, if there was an impact, it was driven by partisanship rather than gender, and it's also really difficult to know which way that's going. So partisans might have just been more supportive of Kavanaugh, but there is an interesting electoral relationship where it looks like where Beto improved over Hillary were like fairly Republican counties, and whether that has anything to do with Kavanaugh or just he's doing better in rural counties is something that we could look more into in the future. Thank you.
One quick question from maybe one of the judges, or from somebody in the audience. Yeah. Oh, we do have a question. Let's get a mic down so we can hear.
I was just wondering, a lot of the data is looking at parties and gender. Did they look at also education? Because I've read a lot about more on the education line is a big area of where people are voting.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. We didn't look at that yesterday, but I think that would definitely be something you'd want in the mix if you were going to dive into this a little bit more. Thanks. Okay, and then I'm going to introduce our next panel. So the next panel is data journalism in the midterms, and In this conversation, we have Lynn Vavreck, who's the Marvin Hoffenberg Professor of American Politics and Public Policy at UCLA, and a contributor to the Upshot at the New York Times. And she's also a 2015 Carnegie Award winner and an expert in campaigns and elections. And with her, we have Nate Silver, who is the founder and editor-in-chief of 538 and a best-selling author. He's perhaps most famous for successfully calling the outcomes in 49 of the 50 states in the 2008 election, and was named one of the world's most influential people by Time magazine in 2009. So looking forward to your conversation.
Thank you. Nate Silver,
Hey, Lynn.
thanks for coming.
Yeah. Took a while. When Kirk was the person who had 2 to 3 airline tickets and 2 to 3 train tickets, and that might have been me.
So you brought the snow with you?
But we were talking. There were correlated errors in my strategy of getting to Boston.
Yeah. Oh, we're gonna go there. Well, just wait. So before we talk about poll aggregating, let's talk a little bit about polls and polling. And I want to give you a chance to react to what you saw in 2018, who's innovating, who's doing it well, and do you have a wish list of things you'd like those pollsters to do better or differently in 2020? How'd they do?
I mean, my wish list would be maybe like the Upshot should do all the polling, pretty much. No, I don't know. We have not done our comprehensive assessment, but we've looked at other people who have, and it seems like polls had, at a minimum, a pretty good year and maybe a very good year. In the House, because of the Upshot and Monmouth, you had some really high quality polls of districts, which you don't usually have, and those polls did really well in sorting out which the toss-up races were, and the toss-ups really were toss-ups in the sense that they could have gone either way. In the Senate, I think the polling was closer to average than great. The Indiana polling average was off by 7 points or something. Missouri was off by 6 or 7 points. You also had some errors in the other direction where Beto outperformed the polling average. Nevada is a state where polls seem to have been lowballing Democrats for several cycles now and did so again. But overall, we'll talk in a minute. I think a lot of the narrative about polling after 2016 was uninformed bullshit. But it's easier when you don't have to tell people they're full of shit, and it's just transparently obvious that the polls were pretty good.
So when you say the Senate polls were average and the House polls were great, you are evaluating how they did, or you're evaluating something about the information they were providing in the lead up to the election? I'm
evaluating how close the margin in the poll is to the actual margin.
And do you think there's something about the way that the polls were conducted in the two different geographies that led to that different performance? Is there any takeaway there?
I think a lot of the Senate races, some of the big pollsters avoided. I'm not quite sure why that is. They're in states that aren't typically swing states, and so therefore you might not have, maybe you don't feel as good about the voter file information you have or whatever else. There are some states like North Dakota where there's not really party registration at all, as I understand it. And so they were races that were high degree of difficulty races, but what happens sometimes is the vacuum is filled by mediocre pollsters and partisan pollsters. At the same time, when you did have some of the big name pollsters going to Indiana or something, they would show Donnelly with the lead. Basically I think, again, the headline is that polls did really well and polls are about as good as they've always been, and that was also true in 2016. The subheadline is I still think there are some somewhat predictable errors. It does seem like in the really red areas that the really white red states, pollsters are doing something where they're not quite capturing how Trumpy the vote is. Mm-hmm. On the flip side, in the Sun Belt, some of these diversifying states, some states with a lot of Hispanics, polls seem to be low on Democrats fairly consistently. I think people don't realize that in 2016 there were actually errors in both directions where Hillary Clinton beat her polling average by 6 or 7 points in California, for example. No one cared because winning California by 30 instead of 23 doesn't really matter, right? But this year it mattered. This year, California Democrats won basically every race that they maybe could have won. There was some late polling in California that showed Democrats doing quite well. some of the early polling in California looked like not very good for Democrats, right? So that's a state where will remain relevant for congressional races at least. And so, so it's always like never as bad or never as good as it seems. So beneath the surface, there are some things for pollsters to work on. I do think with the Upshot and Monmouth are doing where you're calling from a voter file seems like it's a lot better, so you know who you're reaching and who you're not reaching. A lot of the online pollsters were pretty quiet in 2018. You'd expect kind of an explosion of online pollsters, and it was sporadic. It was diving into a few states here and there, a lot of national polls, not so many state polls. So not having enough polls was actually an issue in some Senate races. But overall, I mean, if you, and this goes both for polls and for our forecasts and for other people's forecasts, on a scale of 0 to 10, or let me be a bit more scientific, right? Out of 100 elections where you have...
I was wondering how that was going to change. The 0 to 10 was somehow not going to be good enough.
But this isn't like the 90th to the 95th percentile of making the number of right calls, right? Like, in fact, our model was underconfident, by which it means there were not as many upsets as it would have thought. And you're going to have some cycles like that where kind of it's straight down the middle, and therefore the lean and likely races break overwhelmingly toward the party that's supposed to win them, with some exceptions, Staten Island, for example. And you're going to have years where things are off, and therefore actually the lean Republican races are actually toss-ups because the polls were systematically off. If you don't have a systematic polling error and it's just kind of relatively uncorrelated race-by-race errors, then your forecasts are going to look pretty smart. We do, though, account for the possibility of a correlated polling error, which you saw in 2014 and in 2016, in 2012, the opposite direction, actually.
Right.
So this was like since 2008, this was the best year for polling.
Okay, that's a takeaway. Polling not broken.
Not only is it not broken, but I think the media should be writing that story.
Yeah.
It's a little bit now like the umpire calling balls and strikes, where they can get 98% of the calls right, and then it's not noticed, right? And then you blow a call, and there's a lot of gruff about it, right? And so the media, everyone who wrote kind of the data is broken stories are being irresponsible by not doing the follow-up where the polls kind of nailed it in 2018.
Yeah. When we were here after 2016, I remember the panel on visualization where Amanda talked about ways that they had thought hard about trying to convey the uncertainty, and we talked about field goals and free throws and so ways to try to help readers appreciate what uncertainty is. And you've thought a lot about this. So after 2016, when you started to engage in efforts for 2018, did you think about making any significant changes? What were the things that you thought about doing or did do to try to help your readers along? Or did you just say, it's your responsibility to get this?
I actually philosophically believe more well, let me back up a little bit, right? I think the lesson of 2016, especially in the context of other elections, I don't think it's that people misunderstand polls and probabilities. I mean, it's part of it, right? But it's that people have very, very strong priors, and that it's very hard to get people to override their priors. We on our podcast interviewed Amy Chozick of the New York Times, who wrote a great book called Chasing Hillary, and we were critical of the Times' coverage on this panel, I think, last year. And we kind of got to talking, and she's like, yeah, at the end of the day, people in news bureaus just thought, look, come on, it's Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. We know who's going to win, right? Because this year, Gallup actually asked people, who do you think is going to win the House of Representatives, the Democrats or the Republicans? Only half the public thought that Democrats would win, even though that's what the polls were saying and what the forecast was saying. So I think people just kind of, for whatever reason, there's a narrative or people's intuitions or whatever else, right?
Their party.
Right, their party, sure. Although, I think Democrats were very nervous about how things would go after 2016. But, if you have a forecast that says 70-30, then you can use that either to confirm your nervousness or to confirm your view that the 70% will happen, right? Depending on what your mood is. And people do that. We've been through enough cycles where, in 2012, the narrative was that it was a toss-up between Obama and Romney, which was not the right narrative, right? But it was very hard to get people unmoored from that narrative, even though we thought the polling was pretty unequivocally good for Obama in 2012, for example.
In Signal and Noise, you think about this across topics. Do you think that this phenomenon exists for people across topics? This, like with the weather, for example. If I have a big event, sporting event tomorrow, and they're telling me like, no, there's an 80% chance it's going to snow. Do you think people say like, no, it's not going to snow, it's not?
I mean, probably even in your own life, right? You have like I shouldn't quite tell this, but we had someone at work and they were like, oh, someone give me a job offer, but don't worry, there's only a 10% chance I'm going to take it. I like it here, So you do kind of put that out of your head, right, a little bit. You're like, oh, yeah, okay, I don't have to worry about this at all, right?
Yeah.
But look, I think people, so we did make one presentational change, which is that we show numbers as odds, so like 2 and 5 instead of 39% or whatever, which I think helps. It's a bit rounder in the sense that so people aren't sweating like 39% versus 38.3% as much, and also I think people get that when you have a 1 in 6 chance, that 1 in 6 will happen. I mean, there are various reasons why I think that's better. But at the same time, no, I do think people have the ability to learn from this. And one of the big problems with elections is you only really get a new data point every 2 years or every 4 years if you're only looking at presidential elections. People are a lot more rational about probabilities in sports. I don't think we don't get crap from people if a 30% underdog wins an NBA game and we make forecast of every NBA game, every NFL game, every Major League Baseball game, right? You don't really hear that. You don't hear it if when a 16 seed beat a 1 seed in the NCAA tournament, which is probably a 2% chance in our model. No one gave us crap about that because they understand that actually those things happen very rarely, and that probably a 1 in 50 chance or 1 in 100 chance is about empirically the right call. And so I do think that you gotta demand more of readers and say, we're gonna treat you like friends and treat you like you're smart, right? And give you the honest truth about things and go into a lot of detail, and not be paternalistic where you say, oh, you guys can't handle the truth, right? So I think you train readers that way. So one thing, there have been efforts to try to avoid showing probabilities. I think that's not good in the long run. I think in the long run that just contributes toward innumeracy, and that you have to be willing to put numbers out there and kind of explain it to people and be pretty persistent about explaining what that means and how it works. Because you do see in sports where people are a lot more numerate, and that's just from repeated exposure.
Yeah.
And so if you turn down opportunities to show people things in terms of if you want to do fractions like we do now for some things, that's fine, right? But if you miss opportunities to get people to understand what the long run really means and how these things really work, then you're encouraging your readers to remain ignorant, and you're also encouraging people elsewhere in the media to remain ignorant. A lot of what we spend a lot of bandwidth in election campaigns doing is trying to make sure that things are not misinterpreted when it goes through the filter of another media organization, including, when we go on TV or something, right? We'll have very, 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 very long discussions for a 3-minute ABC News segment about exactly how things are presented,
right,
and what questions are asked, because I think the way that the debate is framed is really important. If you're going on TV and you let someone else frame how your work is presented, you give up a huge amount of control, and so so we really kind of ride people hard to make sure that things are framed in a way that reflects the reality of what we're trying to demonstrate to people.
So when you think about the work that you're doing, so you're getting ready to do that ABC News hit, and you've done all of this work to prepare for that 3 minutes. When you think about not so much the podcast, which is really very conversational, but the website, do you think of yourself as doing statistics and analytics and just reporting out those numbers, or do you think of yourself as a journalist telling the story of what is happening in this political moment?
I think what we do is, first of all, I still design all our elections models myself, and I'm writing the code, and so definitely I'm still doing the dirty work. Yeah, I think what we do is extremely analogous to reporting, actually.
Okay.
I don't know if you say it's a type of reporting or analogous to reporting, but you're diving very deep into a matter. You're really trying to be very comprehensive and thorough and understand it from all angles. Literally polls are a matter of talking to people. There's a lot of data gathering and data collection, gathering data on fundraising. I mean, that's one of the easier examples because like the data is in pretty good shape, right? But there's a lot of fact finding. In fact, just keeping track of all the polls is like literally a full-time job. We rotate around 3 or 4 people, but like vetting those polls, right? When a campaign puts out an internal poll and they're missing a bunch of data that we need for that poll, we spend a lot of time on the phone talking to campaigns and talking to media organizations that don't provide enough detail in their poll, where the numbers contradict or things like that, right?
Yeah.
So there is like a layer of it which just like literally is reporting in a very traditional sense. But no, what we do and rigorous reporting should be thought of, I think, in the same category. And what we really stand against is lazy punditry, basically.
Right.
I mean, increasingly, like as I get older in life, I think life is a battle between lazy people and people who work hard. And I think good data journalism and good any kind of journalism requires hard work.
Yeah. Election night. So in the spirit of this, sort of what is the exercise on election night, there was a moment where you said to everyone, like, hey, people, I'm trying to do 6 things at one time.
Yeah.
And it's pretty clear we've got to reset the parameter on what the model is doing with the partial results. And I think the word you used was we need a more conservative setting.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about where that model comes from originally and what it means in that moment to want to change that parameter. And do you have a set of potential weights a priori where you said, we're going to basically like sample over one of them and that's what it's going to be, and it's not the right one, so we're going to move it? Or is that a panic moment, or what's happening in that moment?
So the challenge of an election night model is that it's like basically as hard as any type of model, so a pre-election model, right? Except everything is happening like literally 100 times as fast. And so, first of all, I don't think we're ever going to get election night models that are going to be foolproof, because you don't know what's going to happen, and no matter how many times you test it in the abstract, there's just not enough time to comprehensively assess what or if there are issues. But to back up, so
do
we
you
had
mean like reporting issues? Like when you say you don't know what's going to happen, like you don't know if the precincts are going to come in, you don't know if the AP is going to.
So let me back. So we had a
yeah.
forecast that started out with the 538 forecast, which had the Democrats with an 85% chance to win the House and the GOP at 81% or whatever in the Senate.
And like it's election day, so is it it's a nowcast? Like is that the idea?
Well, no, then it updates when it gets partially reported results or it gets calls from the ABC
Right.
decision desk. It updates that, and it says, first of all, just tallying up how many races you win or lose, but also because error is correlated, if the first few races are going well or poorly for a party, then it will infer, based on this kind of correlation matrix that underpowers the 538 model, how things are going nationally.
Okay.
So, at some point, the model really did not like the first few sets of results that were being reported for Democrats. It thought McGrath was losing the race in Kentucky 6. Joe Donnelly was losing by a lot in Indiana. And then Nelson was underperforming in Florida. And so it looked at that, and it said, actually, we think based on these races where we have a lot of information, so we have calls, we're late enough in the vote count, we think that Democrats, there's actually a systematic polling error, and it's probably about 2 points, right, where Democrats are being overestimated by about 2 points nationally. And if that's true, then the House is a toss-up.
And so would you say you were a little bit a victim of how those came in, that those were the first couple?
Not a victim. I mean, it's our job to design a model so the model didn't have any bugs in it as far as we know, right? It was kind of doing what was intended to do. Maybe it was designed badly. I mean, unlike the Upshot, we are trying to look just at calls and top level returns. We're not looking at precinct data or county level data, right? And so if you maybe had looked at that, then you would have had more information. But I'd say the information that we chose to focus on was a little scary. If we were, if we knew nothing else, right? And I told you, okay, Democrats lost that Kentucky 6 race that everyone said was the first bellwether of the night. They lost Indiana by 6 points, and Nelson looks like he'll probably lose Florida, right? Then you probably would say, if those were the three things you knew, I think maybe ironically enough, in designing the model to be fairly conservative and not looking at returns where you only had 20% of the vote in, they actually made it in a weird way, too aggressive to move toward Republicans because because it wasn't looking and saying, oh, okay, things are coming in as we expect in Michigan or in Wisconsin or whatever else, the other states that began to report, right? And so but it's very hard to get this right. But the reason why, we kind of built an emergency brake / accelerator into the model where we could just say, okay, be more conservative or be more aggressive. And the reason why is that if this were a model that were happening over the course of days or weeks, then we would go and say, okay, hey, look, our model's down to now showing only a 55% chance Democrats keep the House. Let's spend our weekend looking at this, and we'll write a post explaining why this is, and we'll probably say, you know what, that's how the model was designed. We think, it's doing something sensibly. Maybe it's overreacting a bit, but it's basically fine, and so it'll probably resolve itself, right? On election night, you don't have that time, and so it was kind of like we decided to push this brake where it just becomes more conservative because kind of as a Bayesian, then you have to say, look, I know that there are some other models. You can look at prediction markets. By the way, the exit polls were pretty good for Democrats, right? There are other indicators that our model is not using that that suggest that it's being too aggressive in shifting things toward a toss-up. Therefore, not having time to diagnose whether it's buggy or correct or somewhere in between. We're just going to err on the side of conservatism. We don't have any setting like that for our regular model, but it's that's just the practice of doing something in real time where, we had back tested it too. We back tested it based on partial returns and ABC News calls in past years, but we were able to obtain those only for 3 years, for 2012, 14, and 16. I guess in the training data, what you probably would have wanted is a year that you had a head fake, right? And now we'll have that. But a year where the first few states seem to tell one story, and they're actually not that indicative of where the overall picture is. So, we actually thought that the model was set to too conservative a setting, honestly. We thought we were erring on the side of making it more conservative than it should be. And maybe in some sense it's right, but you never really know, right? And that's why election night forecasting, and by the way, maybe we should also increase the degree of collaboration between different newsrooms on this stuff, because it is a very hard problem, and because both type 1 and type 2 errors are big problems, right? You don't want to call something incorrectly. You also don't want to create movement where there isn't any, but maybe it should be more of a collaborative, a consortium of needles, I guess.
So in the spirit of that collaboration, I'm going to ask you about another collaborative Twitter moment that happened leading up to the election. You had a long discussion, and people then had it also in your absence, about MRP. So we are going to hit that horse one more time. I think what's interesting, there are a lot, we could talk about Twitter for a long time, but one of the things that's interesting about Twitter is the way people auto-narrate, and so they say things like, gee, I really wish I knew what Nate was thinking here, or I wonder, why is he, what is his beef with MRP? So I am channeling those people now and giving you the chance to tell them. You had a really sort of a big reaction, and so I want you to talk about what is your reaction to the method, but then also something you said that I thought was interesting, and I thought, oh, I wonder what Nate means by that, was when you said, we have lots of ways to get 80% toward an answer, and this is just one of them, and I'm not sure why we're privileging it. So tell us a little bit about what your thoughts are there and where you're coming from.
I think MRP is good. I think it's overrated also. It's like the Carmelo Anthony of election forecasting methods. Look.
Okay.
To encounter this problem of saying we want to estimate what the polls would look like in a particular state or district without having any polls of that state or district.
Which you said at the beginning is a problem, right? That's kind of what was going on in the Senate-House dichotomy.
Well, but there are also other ways to do it where you look at non-polling information, right? So you look at
Absolutely.
fundamentals plus national polls, but look.
But this is a problem that you guys have to solve. You
Well,
want to
the
know
problem is,
something about a place where there's no
It's a good
polls.
approximation, but it smooths out a lot of the local variation. I think it's probably more appropriate in a presidential race where you have the same two candidates on the ballot, But if you have a particularly strong incumbent, then that incumbent's going to overperform what you would get from like the generic ballot, for example. And so it's kind of like, the assumption seems to be that, oh, anytime you have deviation from MRP, then it's like noise. I mean, I don't know, right? And it also kind of goes against, to me, the spirit of polling, which is that you're actually collecting raw data and kind of not applying a lot of presumptions to it. And there's a whole kind of in-between space where it's kind of half a poll and half MRP and whatever else. I mean, I don't know. You know, we have a method called Cantor that uses similar districts and kind of, it's not quite MRP in that it doesn't use microdata, but like it's also trying to infer what polls say from polls of other states and districts. And we test that and compare it to the actual polling average of actual polls, and the answer is that it's not really as good as the actual polling average. It's also not as good as these regression-based methods where you're using quote-unquote fundamentals and data on fundraising and past partisanship and whatever else. So I think it's like a useful thing to have in the toolkit, but for some reason people treat it like it's some type of magic. You know, it's also a little hard to calibrate because if you have this whole file of whatever 50,000 interviews from the current election, you don't necessarily have that from the previous elections. You know, I mean, I think the one MRP model that was out there, which is CBS, they had a very narrow confidence band and actually wound up, if Democrats wound up winning 39 or 40 seats, it's like actually kind of on the edge.
On the edge of the band.
Of the band where you're like, especially because other forecasters had like 35-ish seats, 40-ish seats as the core of their range. Like, yeah, you know, that suggests to me that that probably, something was wrong in how those error ranges were calibrated.
Because the band covers the truth?
Because, first of all, directionally, they were wrong relative to the consensus. If you're at 30 versus everyone else is at 35 or 40, right? Not a huge mistake, but if you're wrong relative to the consensus, at least you better have a big error band around that, right? If you're like, we're super confident that it's going to be 30 plus or minus a very small number, and then it winds up being 40, and all types of other smart people who are looking at this think it's going to be 35 or 40, then that's like not great. You know, that ought to cause you to like reconsider, did we design this model effectively or not?
So let's hold off on that sort of what I think of as kind of an epistemological question. And I want to go back to the MRT thing, because I think this is really interesting to me as a scholar of campaigns. And you and I agree on a lot of the stuff that matters in campaigns questions. And so when I think about MRP and I listen to what you're saying, you're not reacting sort of badly to the borrowing strength idea, because you do that. You're borrowing from the past to learn something about the future, and from other things too. And so is it I want to understand it just a little bit better, Nate. So is it the micro? You said that you don't really think there's anything special about the micro level data, but that strikes me as odd. Like we want to know what individuals in these places might be thinking. We don't have measures of them. So we have measures of individuals who are like them in other places. And if we think places are similar, I mean, is that the assumption where where it starts to get?
How similar are they, right? Are you accounting for the fact that, do you have a variable for Mormons in Utah, for example? Do you have a variable for Cubans versus Puerto Ricans versus Mexicans, or Vietnamese Americans versus Chinese Americans, or first generation or second generation, or whatever else, right? You're making a lot of assumptions, and so the best way to know what 500 voters in district are thinking is to conduct a poll of those 500 voters.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think anybody disagrees about that, right? Yeah. But we can't do that in every district in real time all the time.
Upshot did it.
Not in every district. At the end of the day, they're still trying to make a forecast for the House of Representatives. And, there's poor Nate Cohn, man, he's barely alive right now. And if he had to do that in every district in the country, we'd need like 6 of him. So that's.
No, look, where I do think MRP, look, we're considering, using some MRP-like system in our method. It'll probably be the third most important thing that we do. But that part of it that we call Cantor now that infers from polls of other districts and states, I mean, that can probably be improved. But where I think it helps is in some of the more lopsided races, right? It does seem like in these races that Democrats won by 42 points or something, that it came closer than our forecast to the margin in some of those races, right? We also train our model basically only on the swing races because we don't actually care.
Right.
If the Democrat wins by 44 and we say she wins by 36, we don't really give a shit about that. And so so I think we have good methods for dealing with the swing races. The more eccentric races, I think maybe not as much. And look, I think there's upside potential there. I just think specifically in rooms of people like this or on very politics nerd Twitter.
He means that as a compliment.
No, but I just think, again, it's good. It's good. It's not great, but it's good.
I'm going to ask you one more question about this because, so I am sympathetic to what you're saying, that until you get that 1 year where all of a sudden, whites without a college education in Detroit are really different than whites without a college education in rural areas, then you're in trouble. Okay, because you've made this assumption that those people are kind of the same or whatever. I'm sympathetic to this idea that it's good until it's not. And so why take that risk? But then I want to ask you about your sort of, I'm going to say strong, but I mean robust belief in uniform swing and correlated errors. So how do you square those things? I'm a big uniform swing person too. We've talked about this a lot. But yet you're raising the flag on MRP and saying, but I'm not really sure we want to make these assumptions about groups of people. How do you think about that?
I mean, for one thing, our assumption about how errors are correlated or not all comes from back testing the model. I mean, it takes a lot of work, but it's not that hard, or it is hard, but with some work, you can extract what the different components of error are and how correlated the errors are across regions and demographic groups and whatever else. It feels to me like a lot of the MRP stuff hasn't really been back tested, again, because you're relying on having these 60,000 person or very large kind of data sets, and so you're flying without instrumentation a little bit. I mean, look, part of it is part of why I get a little perturbed by these arguments sometimes is we've been doing this for a long time now. 538 has had 6 election cycles if you count midterms. If you count presidential primaries, which are really their own cycles, then it would get us to 9. And it works. Works means that it's right most of the time, and that the probabilities are calibrated more or less right. They were a little underconfident actually this year. And so it's kind of people are trying to reinvent the wheel a little bit when we have fairly good methods of getting 80% of the way there, and it's very hard to get more than 80% of the way there because there is intrinsic uncertainty and because things can change and voters can surprise you, and sometimes your information is not great and candidates are eccentric and weird and do strange things. So it's kind of I think people are trying to solve a problem with MRP that I'm not sure it needs solving, and I'm not sure that MRP marginally improves things that much. And I also think that I'm against over smoothing things.
Yeah.
I think people
So the dynamic part of it, you're also not a fan of. If it were dynamic, DRP kinds of things, is that fair?
No, I just think I don't want to smooth out all the noise, right? Because that noise might not be noise, and it's like when you have a messy scatter plot, and someone draws a trend line over it. Don't draw those trend lines. Just show the data. Show the scatter plot. I want to, maybe you get a poll where, for example, West Virginia's 3rd congressional district is way out of line with what you would expect. That's the most interesting part of the information, right? Maybe it means that the polling is off there. Maybe it means that Ojeda, or however he says his name, is a really good candidate or whatever else, right? It kind of turns out in a lot of these places if you kind of take some dose of the polls and hedge against it with partisanship or other priors, and gosh, you wind up doing pretty well, and that already works pretty well. But I want to see that noisy data point. It's in the outliers that it's the only place you learn anything from is the outliers,
Yes, yeah.
And often they're wrong, but kind of diagnosing, hey, is that a real outlier because it's a different type of race, or is that because of a problem with the way I built my poll or built my model? So I hate when things get to the reader and you see hey, here's an estimate of what the support is in every state, right? And you're okay, this data's already been smoothed, right? This data is not actually a reported fact. It was Amanda was talking about earlier, where what if you take kind of a crude and somewhat wrong and incomplete reported fact versus a kind of model that has an unknown amount of uncertainty in it, and is maybe kind of more right in some sense, but I don't know. I think there's something to be said for hard data. And when you have a poll of 500 people, you know what that means, and you can go back empirically and say how accurate would that poll be or not.
You know what that means, right? And I know what
No,
that
I think the
means,
epistemological status of MRP-based estimates is very fuzzy what that actually means.
Okay,
It's
so
kind of in an uncanny valley where it's not quite reported facts. It's also not, frankly, the best estimate you could make statistically.
But there are a lot of assumptions that go into getting those 500 people, and that was kind of what people liked about the transparency of the Upshot thing, is that you could see how hard it is to get that many people. And they made a ton of assumptions about, how they were going to make those calls and all of that. And the reader doesn't know that, and it does read like hard data and a fact, but we've made tons of assumptions going into that data collection.
But the Upshot did call 500 actual people.
Yes.
They have names and faces and
But even that, even Nate said, then we got to weight it up, and that was like one sentence that came and left, and we didn't really talk about it at all. But there are lots of assumptions in that weighting too, and so I thought that comment that Amanda made was actually really great, and it's something that I struggle with a lot in writing about data, is communicating things that aren't hard facts. Because I know every analysis that I run that I want to write about has a bunch of decisions that I've made. And yes, I'm an expert, and yes, I draw on my training and expertise to make those decisions. But the reader, I think, doesn't know that, for example, Shannon might have made different decisions. And I just think it's hard.
I mean,
it's hard.
So, again, we can see what the track record of MRP is in predicting races out of sample. And I don't just mean out of sample where you withhold some of your data set. I mean, the only predictions that really matter are predictions that you make ahead of time and make publicly. It doesn't count to go after the fact and say, oh, here's what we would have said. You get no credit for that.
Yeah, okay.
So, what's a track record of out of sample MRP performance? I think it's probably decent. I think it's probably not terrific. I think it's probably not as good as the pure kind of polling-based models. But to me, you gain credibility either by having hard facts that you can hang your hat on, or by having a track record of good out of sample predictive performance. And I'm not sure if MRP is in either category yet. And a lot of the reason you can tell is people go back and say, oh, what if we had run this MRP model on 2016? Here's how we would have done, right? I always get suspicious when there's these counterfactuals after the fact, right? That's just to me that you don't actually have very good out of sample performance in the real world, so you have to then kind of go and invent some scenarios where the result and yeah.
Well, the good news is all of this is doable, and there are a lot of people in this room who are not lazy and do want to work hard. So hopefully a lot of people will take that up, but let's take some of their questions now.
Okay, I don't hate MRP, but she's,
No, I'm not. I don't mean to make it sound like you do.
Egging me on.
No. I don't mean to make it sound like you do, and I don't want anyone to take that away from this. But it was an interesting conversation, I think, that happened publicly, and I thought we could drill down a little bit.
Because there were a lot of closet MRP skeptics, right? So someone has to bust it out in the open.
But you did say you're thinking about using it. And you said we're thinking about adding a component of MRP. You said that too. So you're not a hater.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Let's take some questions. Yes, Jonathan.
Do you think your forecast has more uncertainty than MRP-based forecasts because you're averaging over a ton of people's different models and data collections? So the YouGov survey that underlies the CBS data is basically what the YouGov national estimates imply, or the YouGov national estimates imply for all the subgeographies. But the ABC phone poll might imply something different, and they weight it differently. And when you combine an average across all these different outcome spaces, you get something that not only has a different mean, but has a much wider distribution.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how they calibrated their error, but in theory, they should actually have a wider range of uncertainty, because you do better by aggregating polls than by using just one poll. And you saw that. I think YouGov's generic ballot polls had Democrats winning by usually 5 or 6 points, which is it's going to wind up being 7 or 8, and the polling average was 8 or 9. So it's not a huge.
He just said it was 7.5, right? 7.5. Yeah,
Okay.
It was in the last presentation, but yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So then that makes more sense. But
Yeah.
but yeah, if you're just using one, I mean, that's the other issue with MRP is you're relying on one poll and hoping that that method is representative of all polls. I mean, I've thought about things where is there some way to aggregate partial data from different polls and do a kind of aggregate MRP or something, but it should be wider. If you're trying to estimate true real-world uncertainty, then the range should be wider if you're using one poll than if you're aggregating. And the fact that it was smaller makes me a bit, not suspicious, but look, I mean, calibrating errors out of sample well is a difficult problem. You can probably have point estimates that are pretty good and not spend enough effort to kind of calibrate the range right. And I know there are smart people at YouGov and behind those projects. You know, I'm just saying, like, if you're saying that, like, you have all it's not just 538, all the models on the House side were like kind of very much in consensus this year in contrast to like 2016. You're saying all these smart people who have built empirical estimates of error, they're all wrong, and in fact, we're twice as good, even though we're only using just like one poll, our own poll. I mean, that's not really a credible claim on the surface. If you don't take it literally and kind of ignore the confidence interval and say, okay, it's probably twice as wide, but like it's kind of an interesting method, then that's fine.
But you can't really think about it as one poll, right? Because they're in the field like over 40 weeks or however many weeks it was. So it's kind of really like 40 polls or whatever.
Can I jump in since I was involved in the project?
Yeah. No, you who know what happened cannot talk. Yeah.
Well, so there was a national sample that ranged from, let's say, 20 to 60,000 people, and then an oversample in the most competitive districts by our judgment. So maybe an average like 100 or so people in each of those. We didn't have the resources to do a poll in every single district in the country, but we were interested in the overall seats breakdown.
So I'd say two things. One of which is, you know, the Literary Digest poll in 1936, right, surveyed.
Nate.
No, but like, but the sample size isn't that relevant. I think YouGov does really good work.
No, but it's not.
like-
How many individual surveys was it?
So we were in the field for a couple of weeks each time, and we did about monthly surveys from June through November.
Let me make a more specific claim then. I think of those interviews that you're doing, that we would learn more about the election in the aggregate by surveying particular states and districts. And say, we're not trying to be comprehensive, right? That we're going to survey, you know, Kentucky 6 and see what YouGov says about Kentucky 6, right? And from those, you can probably also make inferences in kind of, maybe not quite MRP, right? But like, to me, like, that would be, I think, a better use of resources.
I think that's also a valid and interesting question. It wasn't our goal with this project. But yeah, I guess I would say we were pretty happy with how it performed and the margin of error. I feel like you've harped on avoiding herding and groupthink, and the fact that other smart people were coming up with similar, if slightly different estimates was reassuring to us, but we studiously avoided letting those estimates influence ours, which happened to be a little bit lower, but got pretty close to the result.
I'm not hung up on the point estimate, because again, we think the confidence intervals are wide, and that 30 is not that different than 39 or 40. You know, our objection is to the fact that your guys' confidence interval was half as wide or a third as wide as everyone else's, and like I just think that's wrong. I think like there's not enough information in that data set. There's no magic you can work to be that accurate, and the fact that it was almost on the outer edge is like a sign that like it was wrong. So just double the width of the confidence intervals next time.
An easy fix.
Yeah, I'll consider that.
Who else? Yes.
There was a fair amount made by you and some former employees of yours on political Twitter immediately prior to the election about how the quantity of quality polling during this cycle had matched what it had been at the highest point in other cycles. It also seemed like the Upshot was doing a lot of that polling, and there's been a lot made about how polling is harder and harder. And then you write on your website that Democrats are a systematic polling error away from winning the Senate or something like that. Does the concentration of this quality polling in smaller numbers of sources increase the likelihood of a systematic polling error, and how do you take care of that in your forecasts?
I mean, so we look at how many polls there are in a district, and also, so if you have a lot of polls from like the same source in one district, then you encounter diminishing returns very quickly. You know, I guess we don't really have like a parameter for like for how diverse is the overall set of polling. it helped that but it works both ways. One nice thing about the Upshot polling in so many places is that they can be like the broker in essence, where they let you calibrate and see what everyone else's house effect is. And so in some ways it makes it easier where you have like an anchor where okay, in Upshot terms, what would this poll say or that poll say? And so therefore that was helpful, I think, in the House, where in the Senate, there were often like no good anchors because you had like weird eccentric pollsters. Every once in a while, Marist or Fox News would drop in. But it was hard to be anchored to anything in like Indiana or Missouri because it was all kind of weird pollsters that didn't have high pollster ratings in our data. And so in some sense, the Upshot was helpful.
And the value is that it's the same house, the same method, the same basic kinds of questions being repeated in all of these places.
Yeah, and it was good, right? And clearly very thoughtful polling. Look, we used to have periods where some of the robo-pollsters, PPP or Rasmussen or whatever else, right? Or We Ask America, to bring back a vintage one, where they would poll dozens and dozens of races, and that polling wasn't always that good. And so, so that to me would be a bigger problem. You had like in fact, like a lot of what, frankly, the 538 model was designed for is not to let a PPP or a We Ask America or something like have too much effect on the forecast,
Yeah.
And by the end, it was kind of like when Upshot polls would drop, then like they kind of wouldn't have any effect at the margin because like, okay, we know what the Upshot thinks. And so therefore you can kind of infer what the Upshot would say in every district where you don't have an Upshot poll already. So at some point the Upshot polls would like never move the model more than like a 1/10 of a point or something, at least overall. Maybe in an individual race it could, of course.
Okay, who else? Yes.
Back to the polling question, there's obviously a million different ways to conduct a poll. And I don't think the public really knows that. I think they see a number and they're like, yeah, you just picked up the phone and called 100 people. Are there certain things that you see in a poll that will kind of red flag it right away, you're not going to take it, or are there certain methodologies that you have to see seen for you to accept it?
I mean, we take every poll unless we think the poll is like literally fake. We didn't have too many problems with that this year. There were some fake pollsters, like literally like fake pollsters in special elections earlier this year, and like there were some problems there. But look, there are certain signs of when we get our spidey sense tingling about like maybe a poll is fake. I kind of actually don't want to like reveal that too much because I think like people will try and design their way around them potentially. But like, look, there are some polls that I think there was a Gravis marketing poll in like, which district in Oregon, but like they had like the Democratic incumbent down 23 points and he won by 20 points or something, right? But but usually we're not very results oriented, right? We're not looking and saying, oh, this result we don't buy, therefore we're going to go and exclude it or check a bunch of things. That Oregon poll was like the rare case where like this result is so far off from anyone's expectations. It was like a race that all the forecasters labeled safe D, that we actually did call Gravis and said, we need you to vouch for this poll and make sure that's real and the candidate didn't invent this. But usually you're just saying like, is it a pollster that you've never heard of before? Are they all of a sudden like doing very expensive polling when it's not clear that they have a business model that would support that necessarily? I mean, that's the part of the story that you're doing kind of reporting on. Toward the end of the campaign, I mean, there were one or two weird pollsters that came in like the last week that were like not in races that they really affected things, not in particularly high profile race. There are a couple that we wonder about a little bit, but
For the ones that you use and trust, how much knowledge do you have of their methodology? Like, are they stratifying by age or whatever else? Or are you just kind of trusting that they're taking good polling methods?
I mean, we only use the top line results from the polls, right? And so we're not trying to like extract more information from that. And in some sense, like we don't need to know all that much about it, right? We do need to know like, was it a live caller poll? You get a bonus if you are a live caller poll with cell phones. And is it on the APOR Transparency Initiative list? Because you get a bonus for that too.
Okay.
But apart from that, then we record lots of information, which we keep for just for databases' sake. But it doesn't really affect how the model uses the poll.
Who else has a question? Yes. I'll get you next. Okay.
I believe you said that when you had some concern about your model, you referenced the prediction markets.
Yeah.
What would they bring other than polling analysis? Just possibly insider information, or is there something else that is useful there?
No, the prediction markets, if they had insider information, would have shot way up for Democrats at 5 p.m. when the exit polls were made known to the networks, right? The fact that that move didn't really happen suggests that like they're not actually trading off insider information, because the exit polls suggested that like kind of exactly what happened, right? Democrats were very likely to win the House and very likely not to win the Senate. But look, I think prediction markets I just am so confrontational. I think prediction markets were a little hinky this cycle. You know, I think they were too low on Democratic odds in the House. They kind of presumed, if you broke it down, that there was going to be a systematic polling error that would help Republicans. I think it might have reflected the political preferences of participants in those markets, where it tends to be like, you know, a lot of kind of younger men. I think Democrats were a little bit nervous and scared after 2016.
Maybe hedging, like you were saying before. Maybe people are hedging against this outcome that
But it wasn't very, I mean, to me, like, prediction markets are very, like, mansplaining. Like, prediction markets are people who are sort of smart, but look, to actually build a good house model is really tough. It takes months. And everyone who went through the process of trying to build a house model, and there were 5 or 6 of these that like took into account district level information, and it took months to do this, they all kind of said that Democrats are somewhere in the neighborhood of 75% to 95% to win the House. So it's like, if you're using a few simple heuristics, like I think the heuristic the prediction markets used was like, okay, well, assume Democrats have to win by 7 points based on the generic ballot, and where is the generic ballot relative to that 7-point threshold? So one thing, by the way, you would learn if you actually built a house model is that the threshold was not 7 points. It was more like maybe 5 points. Do people know what I'm talking about? So how much would Democrats have to win the popular vote by to win the House? You know, last year, people, including me, were saying it seems based on some very kind of crude data that probably in the neighborhood of 7 points, 7.5, 6.5, somewhere like that. Because of various factors, including Democrats fielding candidates everywhere, Republican retirements, lots of Democratic money, Pennsylvania redistricting mattered a little bit at the margin too. That number was like brought down more to 5 points or something. But anyway, but all I'm saying is like the prediction markets for the House, right, were based on people using simple heuristics and methods when more rigorous methods implied a different answer. And the fact that like the markets weren't, in a sense, it was just 538, that'd be one thing, right? But the fact that the markets weren't frankly deferring to people who had done all the work that they should have done suggests to me that they're kind of, like I said, like mansplaining, right? And you often kind of get people, there's certain people who like, I have friends like this too.
You mean they're uninformed? No.
They're semi-informed and think they're very informed, right? And there are even people who say, and I have friends like this too, who are like, oh, when markets are so smart that when the market deviates from the model, then you know that the market must be especially insightful and picking up on something. It's like this kind of feedback loop, right? Where it's like, oh, you know, the fact that there's a mispricing must mean that mispricing is real. You know, I don't know. I just was not very impressed by prediction markets this cycle. But they're another like 80% technique. I mean, certainly if I'm sitting there on election night, I'm trying to say, I'm not going to have time to diagnose whether my model is right or wrong, and this is on national television, you know, so let me get a quick and dirty estimate. You know, then going to a prediction market is pretty useful. If I want to know, you know, what the hell is happening with Brexit, I don't want to read all these tedious stories about hard Brexit or soft Brexit or whatever else, right? Then just go to predict it and I get some kind of general sense of where the general parameters are. And so it's kind of like, you know, again, we have an abundance of ways in data journalism, whatever you want to call it, to get 80% of the way there. But I don't think prediction markets do a particularly good job of kind of solving like the last mile problem, if you will.
Are you putting yourself in the 80% set? Are you one of the ways to get to 80%, or are you getting beyond 80%?
I mean, it's at 83%.
Okay, just checking. The gentleman in the white T-shirt.
Nate, a lot of my students would love to come work at 538 or places like it, doing data journalism, looking at sports and politics and something. I'm not sure Harvard gives them great advice. For example, one of my students is right there.
This is awesome.
And
Okay.
he was told
What is about to happen?
And he was told the way to get a job was to run around with his microphone handing it to people. Yeah. And I'm not convinced that's the best advice. What advice do you have for our students who want to follow in your footsteps?
I think publishing your own work. I mean, there are myriad ways to publish through academic channels or through non-academic channels or on a blog. But we're impressed by people who, not that you can't get a great education at Harvard, but people who have good instincts, right? Good instincts for how to look at a data set and ask good empirical questions from that data set. You know, a lot of it's very traditional. We like people who work hard. We like people who seem like they're not jerks. You know, we like people who can communicate well and think quickly, because I think one thing people don't realize is journalism, even data journalism, it moves really fast. That you have to, you know, so you want to have a case where it really is 80% relative to academia. We are very much 80% as good as something that you would do over a much longer time period, and you have to get comfortable with that, right? You have to get comfortable with the fact that you need some provisional, possibly wrong, but accurate enough to publish and more insightful than the alternatives method of diagnosing a problem. And so, yeah, you know, working on the modeling skills, right, the coding skills, the writing skills. I mean, we are really looking for a complete package, but demonstrated through, because we are looking for, you know, it's journalism. You publish your work in journalism, so publish work that we think reflects either sophistication or at least good initial instincts for how to work with.
So let's say he's built the skills. What's your name?
I'm Robert.
Robert. What's your last name, Robert?
Mackenzie.
Robert Mackenzie. Let's say he's built the skills. What is his
my
best?
GitHub?
Has a GitHub. Okay, so
Yeah, that'd be good.
Yeah. So what's Robert's best way of getting enough attention from 538 that you might want to hire him? Does he send you a digital resume? Does he send you a paper resume? Does he call you?
We have paid internships, and those paid internships lead to jobs, not all the time, but certainly some of the time. And those paid interns are doing quite sophisticated work a lot of the time. And so that's we have those. It went on hiatus when we went from ABC or from ESPN to ABC, but we're restoring the paid intern program.
And are most of those people college graduates, or are they college students?
It's been both.
Okay.
But yeah, that's a good way to get in the door, and they're very competitive.
Yeah. And you have a call where you say the deadline is coming up and send, or
We have a
it's
call
just
usually.
open?
Again, there has been one for 6 months, but we're going to have another call soon, and so apply.
Robert Mackenzie.
Yeah. Apply. Encourage your friends to apply. We also try really hard with those internships to have a representative and diverse set of candidates too, and so because that is really important. So they will be coming back soon.
I just didn't want whoever gave Robert advice that this was a good way for him to get a job. I didn't want them to be wrong.
My motivation, I really just wanted to meet Nate Silver.
Well, there you go. Nate, Robert, Nate.
Cool.
Here it is. Okay, who else has a question? I'm sensitive to the fact that I have not been able to call on a woman. Does any lady in the audience have a question? And I'll let you guys think while I ask this gentleman to fill the void. Are you raising your hand? Yeah. Yes. Okay, no.
I was wondering, because between the Texas vote and also just in general, this has kind of been a topic for a lot of people, but with the massive rise in what seems to be a younger generation of voters within this past midterms and potentially for later elections, hopefully, with better turnout, I always felt that when looking at a lot of different models, including 538s, there seemed to be almost less of not necessarily awareness, but it felt like there was, between models as well as polling, that there wasn't as much, kind of like it was almost a generation back when recognizing how the newer generation kind of functions. Like, for example, there's a lot of times with landlines and calls for polling, but a lot of times most people at my age won't answer a random phone call because usually it's a spam call and stuff like that. So I was wondering if maybe if just let's say it does happen to be a systematic error down the line, and if it could be more likely than not a issue with not representing young voters a lot, or Is that possibly
Could be.
being looked into?
You know, where that's very worrisome is going to be in the Democratic primary. Polls in the Democratic primary were actually not very good in 2016. They didn't miscall, well, they miscalled Michigan, which is like a 20-point polling error, so there were some big misses. Indiana was a pretty big one, but yeah, I mean, like, you know, the inability to, like, understand as accurately what young people are thinking, that is a challenge. I mean, in some ways, I mean, Amanda said this earlier, in some ways it's a miracle that polling is as good as it is, right? Where you look at, like, 1 out of every 78 young people ever responds to the poll, and yet they're within about 3 points in the average district, or 4 points or something. Like, that's amazing to me. But maybe we won't be that lucky next time around. And also one thing, you know, because voting in America has become very predictable along demographic lines, and that goes a long way toward making up for a lack of comprehensive response rates, or robust response rates, I meant to say. So, you know, because you can kind of model it, but in the primary, it's very hard to, like, model what people's preferences are relative to the general election, because you're picking between maybe 14 different candidates, and so, like, so I would expect polling to be pretty rough in the primary next year.
And I was just going to say that the two separate things here, there's what the young people think, so their preferences, and then there's how they're answering the poll questions. And those things could be
Separate
consequential in
But
different
you
ways.
have, I mean, you have the combination of the two, which is, you know, I think one of the most interesting pieces of data in American politics in recent times was the extremely sharp age split between
Clinton
Hillary
and
and
Sanders,
Bernie voters.
yeah.
Because, you know, we look at data and, like, we're used to, like, age being like the 5th or 6th most important and predictive variable. Matters at the margin, but, like, you know, it's becoming more important. In that Democratic primary, it was like, if you were over 30, you were very likely to support Clinton. If you were under 30, you were very likely to support Bernie.
And of course, what's hard about this is that if you were doing this in 2008 and she was running against Barack Obama, it would have been exactly the opposite thing.
Yeah.
So you can't even really draw on the past as a way to help for the same exact candidate.
Yeah.
And so that's part of the challenge. Okay, we maybe have time for one more question, maybe two, maybe these two if we're lucky. So we'll go 1 and then 2. Yeah. Go, yeah. Come on down, come on, Robert, come on. Right here, stop.
Thanks very much, guys. One question that I had was about the feedback loop that a lot of these data journalisms sort of might support, in the sense that if people see that you're predicting a probability of someone winning that is closer to 50% chance, then they might be more motivated or inclined to vote than they would be otherwise if they thought this was going to be a 0 chance that my vote will make a difference. And so I was just wondering, A, what do you think the significance of these feedbacks are from your own predictions? And then B, how do you try to quantify that impact that you yourselves are making from posting these predictions?
I think the feedback on voters, I don't think the work on that, which claims there's a feedback, is very rigorous. It's possible, but I'm not even sure, like, directionally which way it's supposed to go. Or are you supposed to become, I mean, certainly people turn out more for elections that they perceive to be close. It's a pretty well-established finding. But at the margin, if you think your candidate's going to win, does that make you more likely or less likely to turn out? I don't even think, like, that directionality has been established. There are, however, like, several types of feedback loops that I do wonder about. One of them, because we are now thinking ahead to the primary, is in the primary where people are voting tactically, and they're trying to decide, there are literally 15 candidates, and I have to not waste my vote, and so which of these 15 candidates are viable? I don't think it's because of, like, models or data journalism per se. I think, but, you know, but media coverage and polling, period, whether or not you put it into a model in the primaries, can have these feedback loops that are actually pretty important to keep track of. Other things I worry about, so there was kind of like an implicit collaboration between, like, what the Upshot was doing, what 538 was doing, and what Cook Political was doing, and some of the other groups like Sabato and Inside Elections, where they would, like, look at our ratings and adjust their ratings, maybe partly because of those, and then our ratings would account for their ratings and adjust for that.
It's telling us we're lightning round. We're almost out of time. That is a high-tech level
And then the districts where Amanda and Nate would or would not poll were based on conversations with Cook Political, and maybe they're looking at 538 too. We never got them to do a Colorado 3 poll or whatever it was. But, like, so, you know, there was this kind of dialogue, And it turned out that kind of all those methods produced like a consensus, which turned out to be actually very good consensus. You know, I do worry that like maybe there'll be one year where that consensus kind of leads everyone in the same direction off a little bit. The other feedback loop is I'm sure that like high information voters and donors are looking at forecasts in order to determine where to send money. You know, at one point we want to do something which is more like a very more rigorous version of that, which is like, here's kind of where you should send your money to get the maximum impact. You know, we actually think that's kind of fairly weird journalistic implications. We may do that anyway for 2020, but if you're a Republican, here's how we can maximize, or a Democrat, but you know, Democrats were, I think, quite strategic in where they sent money, maybe more so than Republicans were, where they're sending, you know, money to like Maxine Waters' opponent or whatever, and she was one of the top-raising Republican challengers, versus some nobody in Minnesota who actually had a chance to win a race in Minnesota, for example. And so I'm sure that it affects. But none of this is new exactly. That for years, campaigns are always competing for media attention, and you see when campaigns release internal polls, right? A lot of times because they're really thirsty for coverage, right? They want someone to write a story about, oh, hey, you know, in Paul Ryan's district, I think Randy Bryce, what his name was, I think he released like 13 or something, not really, I'm exaggerating, but he released like 3 or 4 internal polls because he was like kind of one of these races that was like kind of on the fringe of being competitive and not, and he was trying to get attention so he could like raise more money, I think, and you know, it wound up, I think he lost by 6 or 7 points or a fair bit, but so that feedback loop can have an effect too, where which races people take seriously or not, because in congressional campaigns, unlike presidential campaigns, there aren't enough resources to go around really, and it does make a big difference if the Democrat raises $2 million versus $1 million. You know, that's actually pretty meaningful in a congressional race, and we saw that like a lot of the races where Democrats overperformed were races where they had a big fundraising advantage, and so that's a feedback loop that can affect things.
Okay, this has to be like a super lightning answer because we are literally out of time. But very last question.
He asked a proxy of my question.
A proxy. Okay, great.
Okay.
Nate, thank you so much. Thanks for coming back.
Well, thank you.
Okay, here's what's happening next. I am introducing Cameron Wimpy. So Cameron is a PhD in political science. He studies voting and elections and campaigns on political economy. He is formerly with the Federal Voting Assistance Program and is currently the research director at the MIT Election Data and Science Lab. And he is going to give a lightning presentation.
Thank you. Thank you. So I must apologize, these are not the right slides for the MRP conference. But yeah, so thanks for letting me share a bit about what we're up to. For those who don't know, we were founded last year by Charles Stewart over at MIT. And since then, we've built out our staff and established a number of projects which you may all be interested in. Our real driving goal is to improve the democratic experience for all U.S. voters through the application of scientific principles. We do this by building relationships with other academic and university partners, election officials, government agencies, in some cases nonpartisan policy groups. And really what we're trying to do is create a nexus of what we call election science, where all these groups are working together to improve elections in the U.S. And of course, in our free time, we try to do original political science research. We also try to help others do that with our new initiatives in election science grants, so mainly in that case talking about graduate students and junior scholars funding their research. But I wanted to share with you a few of the projects we have going on. The Elections Performance Index, some of you may recognize. I know some folks here actually worked on that in the past, but formerly it was a Pew product. This year we took it over and we put out the index for 2016. For those who don't know, it's an index that takes 17 variables that measure election administration at the aggregate level across the states since 2008, and then we from that form an index. It's something we're very proud of, and it's something that is exciting that we're going to keep doing and eventually adapt. The Voting Technology Project, I'm sure many of you also heard about. We continue to support that over MIT. It's a long-standing institutional relationship between MIT and Caltech, coming out of the 2000 election and what we all know happened there. But the ultimate goal there is to do something similar, but in this case focusing on election technology in particular. we see one of our major roles as a convener of experts, and as I said earlier, getting all these different groups to talk to each other. So an example of that is next month we're having an election audit summit over at MIT. I don't think there's room for anybody, right? Yeah. Yeah, there's a wait list, so if you want to get on the wait list, we can potentially accommodate that. But we're very excited about it because there's a number of states that don't do audits at all. There's a number of states that do very simple audits, and some of those have expressed interest in improving their system and actually applying audits. And so we're bringing experts from across a variety of academic fields, and then election officials, secretaries of state, others in the policy space to all get together and talk about election audits. We're also working with partners in government and their contractors to do a variety of things. In this case, we're working with EAC and Forrest Marsh Group to improve the EAC's election administration and voting survey, so what we call the EVES. We consider a very underutilized but also ever-improving survey of election administration across the country at the local level. So you can get some very granular data measured much differently than the things we've been talking about most of the day, which makes it fairly interesting for the study of election science. We also have a very active Medium publication where we blog and talk about issues in election science. There's also a section of our website dedicated to what we call explainers with a variety of topics on elections, trying to provide a nonpartisan but very basic introduction to a lot of issues that we talk about, whether it be in the news or in the academic space, but more for the casual observer to read and learn more about and then direct them to other sources. But part of our efforts on this front include other things like conducting our own surveys. So Charles for a long time has done the survey of the performance of American elections. We're still doing that. But also collecting all types of election return data and all types of election administration data. So for example, we have the 2016 precinct returns up, official precinct returns up on our Dataverse and on our GitHub, which is a source that we are very proud of. We're getting started on 2018 as of now, and as those data become official, we'll start posting those up as well. And then finally, just in terms of this small list of things we have going on, we doing an increasing amount of public engagement on Twitter and throughout our Medium blog with the general public and trying to help them better understand issues surrounding elections. And right now is obviously a very important time to talk about that with what's going on in Florida and Georgia and elsewhere in terms of folks misunderstanding the process, where are these ballots coming from, and so on. So that's something we see as very important, something we plan to do more of in the future. Looking ahead, we hopefully we'll get the 2018 official results at the precinct level out much sooner this year. We have a much better handle on how we can do that. And we're working in partnership here with the Harvard Election Data Archive. So if you've been getting your precinct returns there, we're also cross-posting, so it should be the same exact data. And then in the meantime, we'll be posting official returns at all levels of aggregation as we get them together. We expect to have more conferences coming up, conferences within conferences, whether it be at the Southern in January or the Midwest or APSA, the big players, but also the annual Election Science Reform and Administration Conference that we helped sponsor in the summer. Last year was at Wisconsin, but we'll have more on that on our website coming up soon. And then I mentioned the EPI earlier, but we're planning a potential reimagining of that. So talking about including different variables, talking about changing the timeline on which it was released. And one of the things we're going to do for sure is release some of the administrative data earlier. So a lot of it we can't do until the EVES comes out, which is often almost 8-9 months after the election happens. Several of the variables come out much earlier. We already have them. We're going to start putting those out and start talking about that much sooner. And then finally, I've mentioned our partnerships and some of the convening we've done, but a lot of what we see our effort is getting this group together, this election science group, and forming some sort of formal election science network where there can be a lasting group of folks from all these different spaces, so election officials, secretaries of state, state election directors, academics, and those in the policy space can all get together and have something formally where we can talk about these issues openly and keep moving forward that way. So the last thing is just to provide you a way to find more about what we're doing, get in touch. The projects I listed are just a sample. We have a lot more, but this is our main website. This one can direct you to everything. This one is the EPI's website, and that's where you'll see the updates as we make that. We have Twitter, MIT Election Lab, Medium I mentioned, MIT Election Lab. Our GitHub's where we're putting most of our data, at least initially, and then as we get it formalized, totally cleaned, and documented, we're also putting it there on Dataverse. So I don't know if we have any time for also, sorry, we have a few listservs if you're interested. So the top one here, I'll give you a second to take it down if you want, but that is a listserv that Charles has been running for a long time, just for the general election sciences group. So the folks that form the nexus or the core group that might be that network one day. And the second one for those who live in the area is what we call the Boston-Cambridge area election science group. So during the school year, we meet once a month over at MIT to talk about issues in election science. And usually they're very interesting meetings, and a lot comes out of them. So you can get on that listserv there, or you can sign up for our newsletter on our website. In any case, if you're interested in these things, you can contact us, get a hold of any of us who are here, or find us on the website. So that's it.